welcome to Crime in Court. We are reading through the Delphi trial transcript. Richard Allen on trial for the homicides of Libby German and Abby Williams. We are on the state's case, part 23. Melissa Oberg is on the stand. She is the firearms examiner for the state. She used to work for the state of Indiana. Now she is private, I think, some kind of private, I don't know, company. But anyways, she did the firearms examination and the examination of the bullet casing that was found at the scene, and compared it to, firing it, putting cycling it through Richard Allen's gun. And so she is still under direct examination right now, talking about that. She's getting into the different areas of, or the different kinds of levels of examination that she does. So that's kind of where we left off in the middle of it. So I'm going to back up a couple questions. I had to cut it off in the middle of her direct. So I'm backing it up just a couple questions to go back to the different levels of examination that she uses during this process. So please hit that like button and let us begin. So, I believe it is Luttrell who is doing the questioning. I can't recall now, but I want to say it is James Luttrell doing the questioning of this witness. So he asks, is either him or Nick McLeland, I believe. But I believe it's Luttrell, asks, explain the process that you follow for various levels of examination. The witness says the first step on the examination process with getting the evidence starts with a level 1 analysis. A level 1 analysis is basically assessing the condition of any type of evidence that I receive from the outside packaging all the way through the inside, taking descriptive notes and so forth. So the first part is there anything missing? Is there anything broken? Is there any type of biological material? Is there anything adhering to it? So that's the first initial. Anytime I open a package of evidence, I am looking at that type of stuff. So the next part of this level 1 analysis is actually assessing for class characteristics. So if I receive a firearm, I'm going to want to know what type of class characteristics it has, such as caliber, number of lands and grooves, areas and locations of extractor and ejector, shape of firing pin, and so forth. So basically, I'm looking at all the class characteristics, shapes, potential widths of lands and grooves, the direction of the twist, the weight of the bullet. So all those are class characteristics that we talked about before is in this level 1 analysis, and that is either applied to the firearm if one is received and any type of ammunition component if one is received. And what is level 2? So the level 2 analysis starts with the second part of this process and essentially is if a firearm is submitted, the firearm at that time will be test fired. It will not only be test fired, but it'll undergo a function exam to see if there's anything wrong with the firearm, and it'll be test fired multiple times. These test fires are basically what create a visual image of what the inside of the firearm looks like. These test fires can be cycled or they can be actually fired, so that can occur at that time during the testing process. The next step of that is to use what is called a comparison microscope. A comparison microscope is two microscopes hooked together with an optical bridge. It allows the viewer to view two objects simultaneously. It also allows the viewer to manipulate the lighting. It allows the viewer to view it at different magnification levels. So basically, you're going to have object 1, object 2, and you're doing a manual comparison of each object that you're looking at. So whether it be the bullet casing, the gun, whatever, you're doing a manual comparison of all the objects. So you're not only assessing for the class characteristics, but at this time is the point when you start assessing also as well for subclass and individual marks. So that is the first part of level 2 analysis. How essential is the comparison microscope to the work you do? It is basically the prime thing that allows an examiner to make the conclusions that they can make. So, it is the essential part of learning how to move it, manipulate it, and the lighting aspect of it. It also is what takes pictures for us. How unlike looking at a photo like the ones you've already shown us from a comparison microscope, how much unlike a photo is what you see through a comparison microscope? That's a terrible question. Looking through a comparison microscope is like watching a movie. So, from start to finish, this is where she loses me. Comparing it to the movie E.T. I mean, she's lost me already in her long-winded answers, but she really loses me in this ET comparison, movie compare. You're looking at tool markings on bullet casings or the different pieces of markings that you can find, the different markings and whatever grooves, characteristics that you find on the gun itself or the ammo that you're looking at. And she's talking about this is a movie. You're like, it's like watching ET. She says looking through a comparison microscope is like watching a movie. So from start to finish, you're looking at everything that's involved. So if you were to watch the movie ET, you would see the whole thing, the start, the plot, the finish. The unfortunate part is that our recording of this does not. It does not occur through the entire movie. We can only take pictures at certain points. So when you see a picture, it'd be like if I give you a picture of a boy riding a bike in ET, you only see that part of it, so you don't see everything that has elapsed and been done during the examination process. This process is basically for the examiner to remind them of what they came across during their examination process. Huh? But the pictures themselves do not in any way represent everything that was seen at the time of the examination process. Very confusing answer there. So, what is the continue with what the references of on the remainder of level 2? So, the finishing part of a level 2 analysis is that one will do comparisons to items received and they'll do comparisons to tests that they have created themselves. During this process, an examiner can render conclusions at the end of the process that I talked about, like the movie, looking at it through the comparison microscope. So, at the end of it, an examiner can render three different conclusions. Those conclusions can be identification, inconclusive, or exclusion. An identification would be the agreement, sufficient agreement of quantity and quality of marks, as well as sufficient quantity and quality of individual marks, as well as the agreement of class characteristics. The inconclusive part would be if the examiner can't make a decision at that time for some reason or another. They may have agreement of class characteristics, but there just isn't enough information to tell either way. They may not have a lot of marks to go on, and so maybe those class characteristics don't necessarily go together, but they're not fully ready to exclude. So that would be the inconclusive range. And then the last part is the exclusion. A person can make an exclusion with actually not using a comparison microscope. So if you had a bullet that had six lands and grooves with a right twist, and if you had a gun that had five lands and grooves with a right twist, you could actually full outright exclude it. It's not necessary to go through all the steps here. You could actually, in your level 1 analysis, be able to exclude it. The other process of exclusion is that you can exclude based off of the individual characteristics. So the class characteristics may agree, but there's sufficient disagreement of individual characteristics that would allow you to exclude it. Thank you. Excuse me, I'll step through here. I want to hand you, Ms. Oberg, Exhibit 148. Can you look at that, please, and tell the jury if you recognize it? Yes, so this has the Indiana State Police barcode on it. It has my initials, the item number, the case number, and again, it has my initials down here on the tape seal. I'm going to hand you State's Exhibit 278. Will you tell the jury what that is? Yeah. So, State's Exhibit 278 are pictures that were taken at the time of my examination process. It has the outside packaging as well as what was contained in the inside packaging, which was a Winchester 40 Smith and Wesson caliber cartridge. Mr. Luttrell, I was right on my first instinct. It was Mr. Luttrell doing the examination here. He says, "I would move the admission of State's Exhibit 248." Mr. Rosie says, "No objection." The court says, "All right, without objection, 278 is admitted." Mr. Luttrell says, "May I ask to publish it to the jury, please?" Mr. Rosie says, "I thought you said 270. I might have misheard 248. Is that right?" "It's 278." Mr. Luttrell says 278. Mr. Rosie says, "Oh, I'm sorry. 248 is," Mr. Rosie says, "I thought he said 248." The court says, "He did." Mr. Luttrell says, "I did?" Court says, "He said 248, but it's 278." Mr. Rosie says, 278. "Correct, sir," says the court. Ms. Auger says, "Thank you." Mr. Luttrell says, "I'm confusing. My apologies." Court says, "That's all right." Mr. Luttrell says, "We have a lot of numbers here. We don't need any confusion." Court says, "And yes, you may publish." It's Oberg. So is the photo on the top of that, I think, 4-page packet, is that simply a photograph of this object right here? Yes, it is. And States 148, can you tell us how it came to the laboratory and how it came to you? Yes. Hold on one second. What I'm referencing right here is a chain of custody of this particular item. It originated from came into the laboratory from Brian Olahy. We heard from him already on the stand. And then it was given to Stacy Bos- Bozanovsky, who we will be hearing from. We have not heard from her yet, but she will be on the stand. And then I received it from Stacy Bozanovsky. And do you know who Stacy Bozanovsky is? Yes, she's a DNA analyst at the Indiana State Police. So, the cartridge that's been photographed and contained within the packaging of State's Exhibit 148 went to DNA before it went to firearms? Yes, it did. Is that unusual? No, it's not. And why is that? I am a DNA and fingerprint destroyer, so anything that comes to me has the ability to potentially get destroyed, and the reason is because of the way things are handled. So it's always best that it goes through DNA and fingerprints first, and that's because of what I have to do, whether it be manipulating on a scope or the examination process. Our surfaces are not built like DNA, and the fact that they're working in a sterile environment. So if I were to notice something and it hadn't gone to DNA or fingerprints, I'm going to stop my exam immediately and it's going to go back to them. The processes that happen in firearms, it just does not render the ability to maintain that stuff. It's not that we don't try, it's just that we involve a lot of surfaces. We use gloves as much as possible, but gloves tear, especially when you're working with firearms and so forth like that. So we try to preserve, but the process is that it should go there first. Was that whole answer necessary? All you had to do was say the testing and the things that we need to do could destroy DNA. So we send it to DNA first to get it done, and then it comes to me because now I don't have to be extra super duper careful with it about not trying not to destroy DNA evidence. I mean, really, she didn't have to go into that long explanation. When 148 was received by you and you opened it, correct? And was there anything inside this container besides a cartridge? There was a folded piece of white bench coat paper. What is that? And is that a type of paper that you're accustomed to seeing in the laboratory? Yes, I am. And you don't know the origin or you have no information directly on the origin of that particular object? Typically, it comes from our DNA analyst and their examination process. It's something that they use. So they'll open the item on a particular surface, they'll fold it up and put it back in there for retention. We don't mess with that in the firearms section. It's just maintained with the integrity of the item. And how would you describe how did you, when you observed the cartridge inside of 148, describe for the jury its appearance? When I received it, I did not observe any biological material or anything miscellaneous attached to it, no fibers or anything. It looked to be in good condition. I didn't observe any corrosive substances or anything happening at that time. So basically, it was non remarkable to me. Here's a curveball question for you, if you're ready. How many cartridges and cartridge cases have you examined in your 17 years with the Indiana State Police? I don't have a particular number. I can say, I hate that expression. There's not an end at all. There's not an end. Or, I'm sorry, there's not an S at the end of all. She says, alls, I can say, is a lot. Could be thousands? Yes. And do you see them in all different kinds of conditions when they come to you? I'm not talking about the bullet and bullet fragments, that part, but I'm just talking about the cartridges and cartridge cases. Yes. And you're accustomed in those thousands of experiences to see cartridges and cartridge cases in a variety of conditions. Correct. Did this particular item, 148, did it appear to be weathered or in any way affected by the outside environment? I did not observe anything. I can't tell you if it was outside or inside or how it was recovered or what conditions. All I can say is that when it came to me, I did not observe anything that would make me think that it had been in a state where it was in contact with corrosive, either substance or outside. When this was received by you, did you examine it? Yes, I did. Describe for the jury and describe to the jury what we're looking at. So the first submission that I received, initially I received the cartridge, which was my item 16, and I looked at it for class characteristics. I noticed that it was a Winchester 40 Smith& Wesson caliber cartridge. It consisted of a jacketed hollow point bullet that was loaded into it. It had a brass primer, a nickel cartridge case. It also had what appeared to be three ejector marks on the head and at least three extractor marks underneath the rim, and some miscellaneous marks on the head, as well as some marks on the side of the cartridge case walls. Do you still have your model with you, the cartridge model? Yes, I do. Would you mind getting that? When you say you saw three that might be extractor marks, where did you observe those? Extractor or ejectors? Ejectors. So the ejectors are actually on the head, and there appear to be one in one location and then a grouping of two close together. Are you looking at this through the naked eye, or are you using any assistance? So one can observe them either with the naked eye, but most analysts, when they start looking at class characteristics and so forth, or doing any measurements, they're using a stereoscope. So a stereoscope is just a lower powered magnification scope. It's not as powerful as a comparison scope. It sits at your bench and you're able to pull it over any object directly and enhance the magnification to see what's present. And there are other objects here? What else did you receive while you were examining the cartridge? So initially, I only received the cartridge, but during the examination process, I was also made aware that there was a firearm that was recovered, and I hadn't closed out my notes or written a report yet. So I added this item that I received, which was a Glock Model 22 40 Smith& Wesson caliber pistol, and with that, I received a magazine and 15 cartridges. Those 15 cartridges were Federal 40 Smith& Wesson caliber cartridges. Can you give us the date that you received your item 16, R evidence 148, exhibit 148? The initial date that I received item 16 was February 17th, 2017 at approximately 1:37 p.m. And when did you receive this Glock Model 2240 Smith& Wesson caliber pistol? I received this item at first February 17th, and this one I received at 1:06 p.m. Are all the items that you received at the Indiana State Police Laboratory, are there sealing protocol or of any packages received? Yes, there are. And so a package cannot be received by the lab unless it's in a sealed condition. Correct. And what are we seeing in this image? This is an image taken with a comparison microscope. The comparison microscope here, I'm looking at the class characteristics that I saw that were present on the cartridge as received. So initially what I saw were 3 ejector marks. The ejector marks are circled in red here. There's a miscellaneous mark on the primer. I don't know what those marks are from, but they're there. There's also miscellaneous particles inside what I would call the primer crevice. So in this area, I don't know what those are, but that was observed. So multiple things she doesn't know. She doesn't know these miscellaneous marks on the primer. She doesn't know these other miscellaneous particles in the primer crevice. Yet we're supposed to buy what she's trying to sell us when she's looking at all these things, making these observations on this bullet casing and saying, well, I don't know what these things are. But yet we're supposed to trust then when she's just like, yeah, this came from this gun. I don't know. I don't buy it. Mr. Rosie says, Judge, may we approach? The court says, yeah. Sidebar conference conducted. Mr. Rosie says, I'm going to object, but I don't think he's admitted the exhibit yet. Court says he hasn't. Mr. Rosie says, so I'm going to object. He needs to lay a foundation. Mr. Luttrell says, 148's been admitted. It was admitted yesterday. Mr. Rosie says, not the photos, though. Court says the photos haven't unless they're in that. And we've got our first inaudible. It seems to only be really during the sidebars and stuff that we get the inaudibles, that the uh, court reporter doesn't quite hear them during these conversations. Mr. Luttrell says, these photos? Mr. Rosie says, yeah. Mr. Luttrell says, okay, I mean, and we've got another inaudible. Court says, are they contained in 278? Luttrell says, this is an enlargement of the photo with the microscope of 278, so I believe it's been admitted. Rosie says, well, I think if he's going to use that as a demonstrative exhibit, he's got to lay a foundation for it. Mr. Luttrell says, she's already identified it for a demonstrative exhibit for, got an inaudible. Court says, yeah, let's go over there. So Mr. Rosie says, I don't really have a problem with that, but court says, no, 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 I know. Mr. Rosie says, I'm just trying to make sure. I know. And the court says, but this is 278. This is what I've admitted as 278. Mr. Rosie says, these are the magnified images of that. Luttrell says, right. Court says, we don't have any that is, so we don't have any that is magnified. Mr. Luttrell says, you don't have those? Mr. Rosie says, yeah, I don't know. And I also don't know what's coming next, so I just thought I would address this. Court says, sure. Mr. Rosie says, before we get a barrage of, yeah, images, how many images are of the cartridges are on here? Mr. Luttrell says, there'll be images of, there's probably a half a dozen of those. Mr. Rosie says, because I plan on putting them in too. The court says, okay. Mr. Rosie says, so maybe if we took a break, I can look at what he's got, but the court says, okay. Mr. Rosie says, then we don't have to, make this complicated. Court says, okay. Mr. Rosie says, I just didn't know what was coming. Court says, right. Mr. Rosie says, and so the court says, okay. Mr. Rosie, makes sense? Okay. Sidebar conference concluded. Court says, all right, well, let's go ahead and take a quick break. Then, to get this resolved, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and take a break. Okay, so she gives her admonishments, and we're back now. The jury is, oh no, sorry, the jury is out, and the court says, okay, you may be seated. So now this is just in front of the attorneys. You may be seated. So, how much time will we need to get all of this resolved there? Mr. Rosie says, I think, Mr. Luttrell says, I think we can just give him a copy right now. Court says, okay, so you've got those. So just will, and then those will need to be marked and admitted so that we can do this properly. So let's take about 15 minutes then, okay? Mr. Luttrell says, my apologies. The court says, all right, that's all right. Thank you. Mr. McLeland says, thank you, Judge. Off the record, sidebar conference. Now we're back on the record after their 15-minute break. And the court says, this is just a sidebar conference. The court says, I'm glad you brought that up because but I don't see and inaudible. Can't even tell what they were saying during these sidebar conferences. And I think that's by design. Mr. Rosie says, yeah, that's fine. So Jim shared this with me. I appreciate that. I just kind of looked through the pages. I don't have any objections. It's his exhibit. Court says, is this the PowerPoint? Mr. Luttrell says, this is just the PowerPoint. Okay, good, says the court. Mr. Luttrell says, yeah. Court says, because I was just going to ask you, we need the PowerPoint for the record. Okay, go ahead. Mr. Rosie says, my only objection in terms of the admissibility of all this is that what you're planning on doing. I mean, I guess that's what Mr. Luttrell says. I wasn't going to until you objected, but I think I'll just, instead of trying to pull, Mr. Rosie says, you were just going to use it for demonstrative purposes only? Mr. Luttrell says, I'm going to admit it and just go ahead and give copies to the jury. Mr. Rosie says, my issue is that pages 35, well, I numbered them. I'm trying to make this easier. 35, 38, they're not numbered. Court says no. Mr. Rosie says page 43 contain research on the bullets, and I guess I would object on the basis that it's hearsay. I understand that the witness, she can consider and testify based on hearsay. Court says, right. Her testimony can do that. Right. But in terms of the admissibility of the articles and all the other stuff, that's the part that I object to. I can give you those numbers if you want to. Mr. Luttrell says the images do not. The court says, oh, here we go. Mr. Luttrell says the images do not contain the whole article, but they're showing a sampling of the research she did and what a sampling of what supports her conclusions. We're not giving the jury the entire article to read, but this would simply be what the caption is, what the subject matter of the article is. So I don't see how it's hearsay. I think it's relevant and I don't see prejudice to it. Mr. Rosie says, then you've got a complexness problem too. The court says, well, I mean, experts can testify based on their examination and based on their research of articles and stuff like that. I mean, that's not the issue. I think the issue now is the completeness issue, Mr. Rosie says, and it's highlighted, and the court says, and highlighted. So is this going to the jury? Mr. Luttrell says, I can have those articles removed if your court says, okay, I mean, I don't have a problem with them being displayed on the screen and her discussing them, but then giving them to the jury when they're not is probably not proper. Mr. Luttrell says, it's not complete. Mr. Rosie says, it's not going to be few more days, or it's also going to be a few days of deliberations. The court says, yeah, so if you want to, as opposed to giving them this entire packet, if you wait and later on you just want to give them the photographs, I don't have a problem with that. Not one bit. Mr. Luttrell says, So what you're objecting to, all of, the court says, the articles. Mr. Luttrell says, your objections to the articles? Yes, says Mr. Rosie. Mr. Luttrell says, okay. Court says, I mean, and those can be projected up on the screen. Luttrell says, yep. Court says, and she can talk about them, but we just won't give them to the jury. Mr. Luttrell says, that was my original plan. Court says, okay, are you okay with that? My dog is scratching an itch and shaking my whole laptop here. The court says, are you okay with that? Mr. Rosie says, you want me to give you the page number? No, says the court, because it's the pages that have the articles, right? Mr. Rosie says, yep. The court says, okay, 279 is the exhibit number already, says Mr. Rosie. Court says, correct. Mr. Rosie says, okay. Court says, correct. Okay. Mr. Rosie says, all right, very good. Thank you, says the court. Sidebar conference concluded. Now we are back. Or, well, not really. The jury's still not out yet. The court says, all right, we're going to display 279 in its entirety with this witness. The objection from the defendant is sustained as it relates to the articles. She can testify about the articles that she used in her research. I have no problem with that, but giving those to the jury because they're not complete would be improper, and I would sustain the defendant's objection to that part. So if you want to redact those from, are you providing copies to the jurors? We will. We'll redact them, says Mr. Luttrell. Court says, okay, so anything that has the articles in it would not be okay, would not be going back to the jury, okay? With that understanding, then, are we ready to proceed? Mr. Luttrell, yes, Your Honor. Mr. Rosie, are you ready? I am, Your Honor. Court says, okay, let's bring them in. The bailiff says, all rise. The jury enters. The bailiff says, thank you. You may be seated. Court says, all right, Mr. Luttrell. Mr. Luttrell says, thank you, Your Honor. At this time, the state would move the admission of State's Exhibit 279, which is essentially the PowerPoint presentation testimony today. We will remove from the packet the references or the portions of articles that are on the screen. State's Exhibit 279 was offered. The court says, okay, thank you, Mr. Rosie. Mr. Rosie says, no objection. The court says, all right, without objection, then, 279 is admitted. Mr. Luttrell continues his questioning of the witness. I wanted to begin by, we're looking at this image here of the portion of the cartridge that was submitted to you. States Exhibit 148. And while that's up, I wanted you to talk to the jury about the stamp. Is this called the head stamp? Yes. So anything outside of the primer area, what you see stamped there would be considered a head stamp. And explain what's markings or what is stamped on that head stamp. So this head stamp that you see here is Winchester. So this cartridge would have been manufactured or marketed by Winchester, and it is a .40 Smith & Wesson caliber designation. So the Smith & Wesson S&W reference is not to a firearm in this situation. It's not. If you're thinking of Smith & Wesson, the company, it's not that. It's actually, this is the caliber designation. So if you looked at a firearm and say whoever manufactured it, just say it was Glock, a Glock will say on their Glock 40 S&W. That means that you would put .40 Smith & Wesson caliber ammunition into that gun. So it can fit into anything that is designated as .40 Smith & Wesson. Is there anything else about this image, this portion of Exhibit 148, that you'd comment on? No, there's not. The next image, is that also a photograph of State's Exhibit 148? Yes, it is. And what does it show? This shows extractor, or what appear to be extractor marks underneath the rim of the cartridge, and it is what I observed on the comparison microscope. And the next image? This image here shows the sidewall of the cartridge. So again, if you remember the little exhibit from before, it's going to be this side area that I'm looking at. So it's turned to its side on the comparison microscope, and I'm looking to see is there anything that's indicative of maybe chamber marks or magazine lip marks. And what I noticed was in that there, what I noticed is that there was marks present. The two pink arrows, they could potentially be magazine lip marks, they could be from something else. They're not what I would call, they don't have a lot of information there to assess off of, but there is something there. The gray area at the top of the random scratches, I don't know what they're from, but there's just not enough information up there. But I assessed it to see what's there and what potential marks might be there. Let's back up to the submission one slide. We see that photograph of the Glock. Do you compare the Glock or the cartridge on the left, States Exhibit 148, to the Glock? Yes, I did. Could you explain to the jury how you did that? So basically, that goes back to the level 1 and level 2 analysis. I would have function tested the firearm, test fired it, and cycled it, and I would have compared those to the cartridge. That was my item 16. And what was your conclusion after doing so? The conclusion in this firearm to the cartridge what that was submitted is I noticed that there was differences in the position of the ejector mark from the Glock. It was closer to the primer. It looked like it was like an upside down check mark basically. I did not observe any corresponding individual I did not observe any corresponding individual to item 16. I didn't observe any significant class characteristic similarities. However, since I only received one of item 16, I did not officially exclude it, but there was nothing to suggest that that item 16 was cycled in the firearm in item 24. Did you receive later in 2017 another submission? Yes, I did. And what did you receive? In this submission, I received two additional firearms. I received a Smith& Wesson, that this time not to be confused with a cartridge designation, but the actual manufacturer of a firearm, a Smith& Wesson model M&P 40 Smith & Caliber firearm. I also received a magazine, but no ammunition with that firearm. The second firearm I received a Sig Sauer model P239 40 Smith & Wesson caliber pistol. I received a magazine with that, as well as an envelope containing 6 cartridges. Those 6 cartridges were Winchester caliber 40 Smith& Wesson caliber cartridges. They had a different head stamp than item 16 and they had a brass primer and brass cartridge case. So you compared what your number, item 16, which is States Exhibit 148, you compared this to the Smith & Wesson and to the Sig Sauer model P239. Correct. But both of these are 40 caliber Smith & Wesson pistols? That's correct. It's just the Glock was. That's correct. What? It's just the Glock was? What kind of a question is that? I don't know, but she understood it and said that's correct. And your conclusion on both the Smith & Wesson pistol and the Sig Sauer Model 239 pistol was what? So my item 90 with is a I think she means which is a Smith & Wesson model M&P 40. That was very similar to the Glock in the sense that it didn't have similar class characteristics to that item 16. It had differences in the way the shape of the ejector was. It was more oval shaped and it also had ejector shear. It also had nice representative marks on the chamber that I could easily identify back to test, but I did not observe that on item 16. If you're a juror, do you understand anything that she's talking about? Or are you just going to be like, okay, she sounds like she's smart because she says big words and she must know what she's talking about? Because I think that's what a lot of jurors think of experts sometimes. She's just rambling on and saying a bunch of words that make no sense to layfolk who don't understand guns, like myself. And she's just spewing and not making any sense to me. So in this case, again, there was really no similarity in class characteristics and there was no significant agreement of individual characteristics. So while I didn't fully exclude it, there was nothing to suggest that it was from that firearm. The second firearm, the Sig Sauer, the firearm did have similar characteristics to item 16. It also exhibited heavy subclass marks in the ejector mark on the Sig Sauer pistol that were not representative or indicative of what I saw on item 16. So there were similar class characteristics, but the subclass characteristics that I saw on this pistol did not carry over into item 16, nor did I see any other substantial individual characteristics that aligned with item 16. So this one I could not identify or exclude. It was inconclusive at that time. Now, when you examined the Glock, as well as the Smith& Wesson, and as well as the Sig Sauer Model 239, did you do test fires and test cycles? Yes, I did. Explain to the jury how you actually do that. So basically, initially, what you saw today was cycling. That is how I would have it would have been a mandatory setting, and I would have actually had the firearm raised. But the way the way I would have cycled is that I would have loaded ammunition into a magazine and I simply would have just kept on pulling back on the slide to cycle every several cartridges through there. I also then would have test fired each firearm. And where do you test fire them? Firearms are test fired in our water tank in the Indiana State Police. So basically, you'll load the magazine, put it in the magazine well, and you'll fire those. The bullets will land in the water, and the cartridge cases will extract and eject to the side of the firearm. Now, your State's Exhibit 148, your item 16, is a Winchester cartridge that you received in February of 2017. It's a cartridge. It's not a As you explained, it's not a fired or spent casing, correct? It was not fired, no. So explain to the jury why you did test fires with these firearms. I will always do test fires, even in cycled cases, because it's important for an examiner to understand what the difference is between the fired and cycled marks, if there is a difference. Yeah, there's going to be a difference. You're firing one, and the other one doesn't get fired at all. So there's going to be a difference. I don't know what this woman's talking about. Sometimes there's not very much difference between the two, so I want to be able to see the difference. If there is any differences or if there's substantial difference between them, so I'm going to take both fired and cycled. The firing process creates a lot more pressure than just cycling, so it at times they can give you a much better picture of what you're actually seeing and much better duplication of the marks that are occurring. The various tools inside the firearm when you cycle it are also acting upon the fire or the cartridge. Objection leading. Sustained. What is the similarity between a cycled cartridge and a fired bullet that ejects a casing? So the similarities are you load it into the magazine, you're going to rack that slide to the rear. It goes into the same chamber slide and it can come into contact with any of those tools in there. The only difference really is the pressure that happens. The pressure during firing is much greater than it is with cycling. So that's going to be your main difference. But it doesn't suddenly go into like a magic turn out of the firearm. It goes in the same hole the same way, and it's just the difference in pressure that's actually occurring between the two. The only difference of cycling around, according to this witness, and firing around is the pressure. I call BS because you don't have the explosion of the bullet either. So, I mean, there's a lot of factors that take place in the firing of a bullet and what happens to the ammo. And that none of that's happening when you're just cycling it through a gun. Can you give us the date? I've asked you for the date of submission 1. Can you give us the date that you received and examined this Smith& Wesson pistol and the Sig Sauer Model 239? So item 90, which is the Smith& Wesson, I received that on February 27th, 2017. The second pistol here, the Sig Sauer pistol, I received on 3 hold on, sorry, my mistake. I received it on 2/28, 2017. So you had a third submission of firearms, is that correct? Yes. Describe what that consisted of. So I received a bunch of bags of water and guns, and the actual second picture right here was a manila envelope. So it was not in water, but all four of these guns were received in water, and my task was to make them safe and check to see if they fit the caliber of item 16 or if they could have potentially fired or cycled item 16. So what I did is I took the guns out of the water. I tried to restore them as best as possible. The first thing is always safety, so making sure they're unloaded. All of those guns were seized and had some form of gunk attached to them, or shells, or a lot of random stuff attached to them from being in the water. So I had to let them sit in rust release, whatever that is. Let them sit in rust release for quite a while to unseize some of them. The first firearm that you see up there right here, she indicates, this was found to be a Springfield Armory 45 auto caliber semi automatic pistol. I could never make it functional, but I was able to restore what it was and the serial number. The second portion over here, I wasn't sure what this stuff was. I tried to restore it as well, and basically at the end of the day, it disintegrated. I have no idea what it was or uh, what it was a part of or what it was. They were just miscellaneous objects that I received. The lower three firearms all are not of the 40 caliber Smith& Wesson family. So basically all of these I basically had to hammer or break to make sure that they were safe and that they could be stored appropriately. So none of these actually fit or could have cycled item 16. What was the point of that entire explanation? Can you tell the jury when you received these items that are shown on the screen under submission 3? So the first item that I received was item 273, which would have been the firearm, the Springfield Armory. That was received on 8/23/2022 at 12:26 p.m. The rest of the items received here were received on 8/23/2022 at 1:26 p.m. Next, submission 4. What was submission 4? Submission 4 was item 348 was submitted to me. It was a Sig Sauer model P226 40 Smith& Wesson caliber pistol. It was bearing the serial number ending in 627. I also received item 315, which was a Winchester 40 Smith and Wesson caliber. I also received item 316, which was a Blazer 40 Smith and Wesson caliber cartridge, and I received two magazines that each had cartridges in them that were Blazer 40 Smith and Wesson caliber cartridges. I want to mention that she just changed the model number of the Sig Sauer again. Like it keeps going from P230 whatever it was. And yeah, 239 model, a Sig Sauer model 239. And here she just changed it to 226. And I feel like it's been going back and forth throughout the trial here. I'm not really sure. Um, Next question. So this photo here on the left, is this item right here? Yes. The previous Sig Sauer that you had examined and received in late February of 2017, how does it compare to this model, the 226? So there are differences in magazine styles. The width of the magazine well area is different because the magazine in the first one is basically a single stack. This is a double stack. There are probably slight other differences that can happen. But since I didn't have the firearms next to each other, I couldn't do a full-on comparison of any of the other differences. Ms. Oberg, I'm going to hand you State's Exhibit 280 and ask if you can identify this. So State's Exhibit 280 is my item 315, which would be a Winchester 40 Smith& Wesson caliber cartridge. And State's Exhibit 281? State's Exhibit 281 is representative of my item 316, which would be a Blazer 40 Smith& Wesson caliber cartridge. And State's Exhibit 282. State's Exhibit 282 would be consistent of the two magazines with the ammunition that was received in them that are packaged in these two manila envelopes now for me. Mr. Luttrell says, I would move the admission of State's Exhibits 280, 281, and 282. No objection. All right, they're admitted. Mr. Luttrell says, and for the record, based upon the testimony yesterday, these items were collected at the same time as State's Exhibit 276 in the search warrant of the defendant's home. You received these items when again? I received these items 10/14/2022 at 2:12 p.m. So this would have been received 5.5 years following receipt of State's Exhibit 148 on your item 16, the Winchester Smith& Wesson 40 cartridge. Correct. Are you aware of studies that deal with the characteristics of longevity when it comes to firearms if you're going to be examining something 5 years after you received an item that you'll be comparing it to? Yes. As I've stated previously, some of the black box studies deal with longevity. The Indiana State Police actually possessed a 10,000 round test that examiners could look at and do comparisons on. That 10,000 round test was of bullets. Would you explain what do you mean by a 10,000 round test? So our troopers used to carry Beretta pistols. So what they do is they will do a longevity test of these pistols to see how well they hold up over time. During that time, they collected and I think it was every 10th round that was fired into the barrels that they used. So that was collected and maintained through the Indiana State Police in the firearms section. That way, examiners could look at things that were fired over time and they could see what it looks like for things to be fired a lot. Have you conducted or have you warmed yourself to research of issues of longevity of firearms? Yes. I mean, typically, in any longevity study, typically what happens is that you may be able to identify for a while, but in some cases, if the firearm does not hold up, typically you're not able to identify at some point in time. Sometimes with some firearms, it's not a problem. Some firearms, depending on what the manufacturing process was, it may subside after a time and you may not be able to identify back to that firearm. Typically, what happens, at least what I could see in the Indiana State Police 10,000 round test is that sometimes you will get a little bit of dropout, and some of the bigger studies, it could be potential that you just lose everything because the firearm just depreciates, and that's over a very long time. Typically, most firearms, when you're firing a couple hundred rounds or a couple thousand rounds, you're not seeing that depreciation quite as fast. And does it also depends does the person clean, use a bore brush, or so forth, and expose it to potential chemicals that could break down the inside surface? You examined the Sig Sauer Model 226, did you not? Yes, I did. And would you describe its condition describe its condition and the condition that you found it in? As I found it, it didn't appear to have anything broken. It functioned as designed. There was some orange substance in the breech face area that appeared to be from firing a certain type of ammunition. It might have been from primer, sealant, or so forth, but other than that, there was nothing that I noticed that looked to be out of character for what I would typically see from a firearm that I received. Explain to the jury how you proceeded to this examination of the comparing the cartridge. States Exhibit 148. With this firearm, States Exhibit 226. So, similar process as before, doing the level 1 and level 2 analysis, of course. At this point, I had already examined item 16 multiple times, so I'm looking at the level 1 and level 2 analysis of the firearm that I received. So, I'll complete those steps. I'll function exam the firearm and I'll get test fires and test cycles from the firearm, and then I will proceed to the comparison process at that time, which I can render a conclusion. And in the process of doing so, you utilized your comparison microscope, obviously? Correct. And you took photographs? Yes, I did. What's the purpose of taking photographs? The purpose of taking photographs at the time of examination is to have from for the examiner to recollect their memory. They are not to be used for identification purposes. That is not something that an examiner will do in the firearms unit. They are made for memory purposes, so that the examiner, when they can testify to the areas that they looked at. Again, going back to the movie, the pictures are not the movie, they are just capturing certain points of the examination process. An examiner, an examiner, an examiner does the best that they can to take pictures and try to capture everything, but at the end of the day, it's a 3D object and you're trying to capture it with a 2D portion. So you won't be able to get everything picked up in a picture. Well, why don't you take video? That would be better, right? We try our best, but they are for recollection and memory purposes. We do not do examinations on them. Would any firearm examiner who's certified and follows the training that would be approved by AFTE, would they offer an opinion based upon studying photographs? So, at the Indiana State Police, we do not render conclusions off of photographs. For the majority of people I know, they did not render conclusions off of photographs. I know in some limited instances, I had heard of some laboratories that might take pictures of something that is typically really good, something associated maybe like with a Glock. They may be able to, their guidelines may allow them to render a conclusion, and that would not be the initial conclusion, that would be of the verification process. So, only in some limited situations by some laboratories for the verification process? Yes. I mean, I wasn't very familiar with that being done, but I do know that there's at least one laboratory that does it. For your purpose, for showing the jury photographs is not to conduct an examination here in court? No, it is not. It would be inappropriate to do that. So photographs are not to examine, just for memory purposes. Well, then why do we show them to the jury if it's going to cause the jury to examine them? You know what I'm saying? I believe I've walked away from my clicker. What do we see in this image, ma'am? The image right here is a picture of the ejector on the head. This on the left-hand side here is item 16, and this is the test fire from the firearm that I received in this case. So that's in item 314. You'll see case number, you'll see item number, you'll see magnification level, the hairline right here, and the area that I circled was the area that I was looking at. The jury's familiar. I believe they've seen multiple packages that bear the number 17K triple 066. Is that number? What is that number? That was the first case number that I received, so item 16 would have been received underneath the case number. What is 19K00197? That would have been when I received the firearm. It came in underneath that case number. Why did the case number change? From what I was told is that within our laboratory information management system that there was some maxing out of the first case number and they were not able to add items into it and there were some issues going on. So they had to create the additional case. Is the 17 and the 19 a reference to, well, what is the reference to? Basically, those are the case numbers that each item was submitted underneath. So item 16 would have been referenced as the 17K case, and item 315 would have been underneath the 19K case. That's only because you ran out of numbers on the 17K. That's what I was told. Whether that's true or not, I can't confirm. But it's the same case. Correct. And does 17 relate to the year? Yes, it does. And the 19 would again relate to 2 years later? Yes. Whenever they pulled that out, if they submitted more evidence underneath the case number, it would have been relevant to when they submitted the first item in that year. Well, let's go back to this. You've test fired and test cycled pistols, this item 276, and then compared those test cycles and test firings to State's Exhibit 148, the Winchester Smith& Wesson that you received, cartridge that you received in February of 2017, correct? That is correct. And what was the result of your judge request a sidebar conference conducted? Mr. Rosie says, I'm sorry. Court says, no, you're fine. Mr. Rosie says, we're obviously going to get to her conclusions. The court says, mm-hmm. Mr. Rosie says, I'm going to just make the record that I'm going to object to her testifying that there's sufficient agreement between any of the test fired rounds in that firearm or the item 16 and the firearm based on the arguments that are referenced in the June 13th, 2023 motion in limine regarding ballistics that you've summarily denied. I'm just going to make it now. Court says, that's fine. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sidebar conference concluded. What was the result of your examination, ma'am? I was able to identify the pistol in item 314 as having having cycled the cartridge in item 16. So this cartridge contained in this package marked cartridge near bodies. You were able to identify that it had been cycled through this firearm that came from the defendant's home, State's Exhibit 276, or your item 314? Yes, I was. This is some BS science right here. And I really hope that that can be appealed because I don't even know if that's particularly the way that you can say that. He asked, were you able to identify it as having been cycled through his firearm? In looking at this image that we just previously showed the jury, does this remind you and give you an ability to articulate for the jury one of the things that you identified or used in making this identification? Yes. Will you please explain that? So basically, here I'm looking at the ejector mark and I'm looking at the edge of the ejector towards this would be the rim area over here. And so I'm looking at that area first. The next image? This next image is another image of the same area, but I'm moving the hairline over to look at the area that I'm observing. And this third image. So I walked around this ejector all the way around in a 360 view to see the different things that I could observe in different lighting and different areas. So this is basically a different area of the ejector and areas of agreement that I could see. The next image. This image is the same thing. I'm turning it around, adjusting the light to see what else I could see. This was another area that I could see of agreement. Would you explain for the jury? We talked about the numbers on the left side of this blue banner at the bottom of the image. Would you explain to the jury the numbers on the right side? It begins with 016. So basically, 016, this is item 16, which would be represented on the left, and on the this side is going to be my test fires from item 314 on the right hand side. This 60 times is the magnification level I use to observe this. Did you observe that particular portion at various magnification marks? Yes, I did. So when you see 1 or 016 there and the various test items that you compared it to, that is this item, cartridge, Stace Exhibit 148, the cartridge near bodies. Is that correct? That's correct. What is this image? This image is another rotation and adjustment of the light so that I can observe other things. This is outside of the parallel marks originally observed on the very edge, just showing some more areas of agreement that I could see with adjusting the light. And what does this slide with the 5 images show us? These 5 images here are representative of the photos that I took at the time of my examination process to remind me of the areas that I looked at, and this is just all of them compiled together. This is just the ejector marks, so it's just that section so far. What is this, ma'am? This picture is a direct observation of the ejector in the pistol. So this is where I talked about on the earlier slide about ways to identify class, subclass, and individual. And here I'm doing a direct observation of the ejector itself in the pistol. What I can tell you about this is that the ejector itself did have subclass markings present on it. The subclass is from these lines to go directly all the way across those would-be subclass. Another interesting fact about this ejector is down here on the bottom. It has a recessed portion. This is actually the portion that is making the ejector mark. It does have some of that subclass also present down there on the bottom. So what I'm doing here is I'm directly observing. I'm noting that there is potential for subclass and that when I'm doing my examination process, I should be very aware that subclass could be a potential. What? This woman's answers are so long-winded. So by subclass means other firearms manufactured in the same lot could share those characteristics. Wouldn't necessarily mean the same firearms, but ejectors. Ejectors. Okay, so this slide showing, well, tell the jury what it shows. So this slide is in relation to the ejector that I directly observed. The process that appeared to be going on with the ejector is that it was ground. That grinding process has a potential to be observed, and others have observed that process in our community as well. So there's 2 articles here that talk about grinding and the potential for subclass, and also the potential for individual characteristics that can be found in that grinding process. So the bottom one with 9 mm Smith & Wesson ejectors, these are a series of ejectors. They are not consecutively made, but these are a series of ejectors that was observed by somebody taking an armorer's course. So they wanted to look at them, and they ended up casting them and looking at them and noting that they did have subclass characteristics, but they also possessed individual characteristics that they were able to look at to differentiate one ejector from the other ejector. The top article is by Stephanie Ackerman, and she looked at chisels. Some of them were consecutively manufactured, and the final process was a grinding process. She noted that an examiner could make an identification on the grinding process even though that they were consecutively made. Okay. And why would you look at a study on chisels when you're conducting this examination? For us, it doesn't matter what tool it is, we want to know the process that was used. The process is what is important. So whether it's ground, whether it's milled, whether it's lathed, whether it's mimed, M-I-M-ed, I don't know, which is a molding technique, any type of study that's out there that studies these processes, which makes the tools that we see, we would be interested in them. So it could be any of those processes, no matter which type of tool it makes. And these two studies simply a representation or a representative sample of other research that you're aware of in this area? Yes, this is just some basic articles that I would have come across during my training and experience and from taking subclass courses. Did you serve to support and inform your decision and your conclusions in this matter? Those articles, do they serve and support your decision? Yes, they do. Next, you look at another tool on the firearm, is that correct? Yes, I did. What is this image? This is an image. So if you're looking at the one of the ejectors down in the bottom for you guys, this is going to be the left-hand corner. This would be up in the area right here. It's a mark that is found on the head, and I noticed throughout my examination process and looking at the cycling of this firearm that there's an area on the barrel that comes into contact that with a cartridge up there that can potentially make that mark. So this is an image of the agreement that I saw on that at that time. Again, this is an item 16. This is item 16 on your left, and on the right is 314. And I did use test 2 in this case. This is a 60 times magnification level. And again, you looked at it under various magnification levels, correct? Yes, I did. And photographed it under the 60? Correct. First set of photos you saw, the five that you've been describing to the jury, were all ejector? Correct. And what is causing this? This would be the front of the chamber face area of the barrel of the firearm. You talked about one of your earlier images, not of this firearm, but one of your earlier images. You showed how there was a shape to the chamber face area. Is that correct? That is correct. Tell us about this chamber, the firearm, 314. So the chamber face of this firearm has this raised, well, this portion here, and it has the U shape. It's also attached to what you see behind here, because that's the barrel. So what you're seeing here is the area that is coming into contact with the head of the cartridge. And what conclusion did you come to when you examined the marks of the chamber area marks of this cartridge? Sorry, could you repeat that again? What was your assessment at that time after examining the chamber area of the firearm and the chamber marks? So this head area or the face of this chamber face is that I noticed that it was manufactured in a milling way. So the barrel is drilled, then it's milled. I was able to observe that here. I also ended up painting this area. I actually painted because I wanted to actually cycle a cartridge in there to see does it hit the head in the area that I'm observing. And so I was able to do that as well. And interesting part about this area up here, as you can see, it comes to a point. So in the firearm, it comes down to a point. When examiners see that area coming down to a point, it has a good potential of leaving behind individual characteristics. And did you observe any individual characteristics that you related back to this chamber? Yes, I did. And did you do research and had you done research previous on this chamber face area? I had been exposed to previous research at training classes. What is this article? This article is an article published by Rachel Bolton King and others on here. It talks about the manufacturing of a SIG pistol and it talks about the barrel process and specifically, now this is a 9mm in here. So it is not referencing the 40 caliber. Why I looked at this article and why I paid special attention to it is because she talks about the milling process that SIGs use. So if you go to the next slide, she talks about the milling process that are used on Sig Sauer barrels. Now, it's not specifically the 40, but it talks about the 90 millimeter. Would that manufacturing process be similar? I would expect it to be somewhat similar, and also for the various fact that I looked at the barrel directly and I could tell that milling was used as a process on this barrel. What further does this article communicate that you felt was relevant? So, when she toured the factory at SIG, she is a European analyst. So she toured the factory over in Europe. What she noticed was that during the milling process, the first steel piece is cut off and turned away with cutting head one. So the first portion of the barrel is cut with cutting head one, while the second piece is produced at the same time. So a second barrel coming behind it is cut with a second cutting head. So something that's consecutively running on a line gets cut with the first cutter. The second barrel behind it gets cut with the second cutter, meaning that from the start process right there, they're not consecutive in that machine that's processing it. Okay. And why is that important to you as a firearm analyst? So, as I talked about before, we do studies where we look at consecutively made items. And so, consecutively made items are typically those items that could present potential problems in the sense that they would be manufactured at the same time. And so, they could show more relatable individual characteristics or potential subclass characteristics. But the fact that they're two different tools are doing the two consecutive barrels, what does that suggest to you? Well, it suggests that, at least in this operation lot, that they're working with on that particular piece of equipment, that those barrels that are going in there are that are the barrels that are going in there aren't from the very start consecutively made. And why is that important to you? It's important to me because it lets me know that there's at least two cutting heads in there, and that I can deduce that there is a potential that even made at the same time in the same lot, that it would not be consecutive for how it's operating on that one machine. If we would go back, there's actually more to the article. Yes. So she does go on to talk a little bit further about this, and she says the use of two cutting head. Now she's reading from the article. The use of two cutting heads is particularly noteworthy for any firearm examiner undertaking tool mark comparison and investigation utilizing consecutive by a barrel manufacturer or when investigating potential subclass characteristics. Another aspect to highlight is that there are six CNC milling machines located at the factory that are all used for barrel manufacturing, and a variable number may be running at any one time to produce one batch of pistols. So that means that six machines, two heads apiece, so there's 12 heads cutting during one lot. She then further talks about a robot will then polish the external surfaces of the barrel and moves the barrel into a laser machine which engraves the serial number. What is the significance of six lines of production going with two different tools on each of the six lines? What is the significance to you when you're looking to see if you can find individual characteristics on a Sig Sauer? It could be suggestive that the marks that I'm seeing would be indicative of individual because they are not consecutively made. That doesn't mean that it is. One would have to evaluate the surface and the actual mark that is coming from here. But it has a high likelihood of it not being consecutively made, is all I can state. And if not consecutively made, what impact does that have on the idea of subclass characteristics showing up on an item? The subclass characteristics could be less. One would have to evaluate those. but I can't tell you definitely. I can tell you just that there is a potential that it could be less. Are you ready for the next item? Yes, please. What are we looking at here? So here, this is another area that I observed, which was the extractor mark underneath the rim. Something to look at here is that there, as I talked about earlier, like way earlier, about striated and impressed marks, that some tools can make both. And in this case, we are seeing that here. Here, you're actually seeing the impressed mark of the extractor. What's interesting is you see the movement forward of the extractor creating stria, and then you see the movement back, created the striated area. So it has a lot of movement going on when it's being extracted and ejected. So that could potentially be from the unevenness of the ejector that is in this firearm. And why is that? It just happens to be that it is coming into contact a couple different ways. It's hitting that impressed area and then it can move as it's being extracted and ejected from the firearm. And the potential of marks being made on that cartridge each time those actions occur, I'm not quite sure what you're asking. I'll withdraw that. What are we looking at here? So in this picture here, this is a picture of the extractor. So the extractor in the firearm is actually curled around. I'm actually looking at the back of the extractor in the sense that this area does not come into contact with the actual cartridge. So as installed, I can't see around this area here. So what I could observe was the outside area. This outside area did not have mold or MIM line to it. So it did not appear to be MIM'd in any shape or form, at least from this observation. And the reason that's important is because MIMing can have a high potential for leaving subclass behind, but if there's additional processes done to that MIMing process, there's a potential that it could have individual. And have you studied and researched this area of the extractor mark? I have come into contact with different articles that talk about extractors and the marks that they can leave behind. What do these two articles represent? So, the first article up top is a study in which an analyst looked at Remington 870 shotguns and they looked at extractor marks from Remington 870 shotguns. They looked at both cycled and fired components from here and they were able to tell even with Judge, I'd object to the question, and may I make a preliminary question? You may. Mr. Rosie says, Ms. Oberg, these manufacturers, take the same extractor that is manufactured and installed in a Remington 870 shotgun and place those in Sig Sauer P226 handguns? No. Mr. Rosie says, I'd object to relevance and to 403 also. They're comparing apples to oranges. Court says, relevance? How did this article support your conclusion in this? The court says, no, no, no. Excuse me. What is your response to his relevance objection? How is this relevant? Mr. Luttrell says, yes, Your Honor, this is relevant because it's part of the research that she was aware of, that she has testified assisted her in making this identification. She's permitted to refer to those articles. Court says, I guess it would go to the weight the jury would give that particular research versus its admissibility, so I'll overrule the objection. Thank you. Why did you direct your attention to this article? I directed our attention to this because it also deals with milling. As I had stated earlier, the barrel had a milled process done to it as well. And this one, while it does talk about extractors, it also relates back to the milling process. While it's studied on a different object or a different tool, it is relevant in the fact that it is a study of a milling process. It's also a study of things that were made at the same time and whether an analyst can come to a conclusion of identification of things that are made to the same time, made at the same time. And what did you learn from this research? What was interesting about this research was even though there were MIM'd extractors present here, and this was the only mark that the person was observing, that they were able to still differentiate between the milled surfaces. Sorry, not milled, the MIM'd surfaces. There were additional things that were done to the MIM'd parts, the finishing processes that allowed her to do that. So she was able to differentiate all the milled extractors as well. The second article? The second article below deals with extractors that were made at the same time as well, and the process here was milling as well. And what this study does is that it was sent out to examiners to evaluate. These examiners were only allowed to do comparisons on the extractor marks themselves. Mr. Rosie says, I'm going to make the same objection I made before. It looks like it's a Remington 870 case study, so same objection. Court says, overruled. Again, I think it goes to the weight rather than admissibility. Thank you, says Mr. Rosie. How did a study on these ejectors, or excuse me, extractors, how does this relate to your examination in this particular case? So, in this particular case, it lets me know that examiners, even looking at things that are manufactured at the same time, could come to a conclusion only on extractor marks. They did not need other marks to look at to come to a conclusion, but they could use extractor marks alone to come to a conclusion. In this particular study, there were over 250 comparisons, and 259 were correct, and 3 were incorrect based off of just looking at extractor marks alone. In examining of the firearm from the defendant's home and the comparing it to the item that was taken from the crime scene, did you find what you believe to be individual characteristics that you can identify? Yes, and that would be based on the striated portion. So, impressed marks have a tendency to be higher in the subclass area, but in this case, I not only had impressed, but I had striated marks. I believe striated marks were created from the extractor that appear to, based on the impressed mark, have what looks like an irregular edge. And did you go to research to assess your identification in this case? Well, these would have been articles that I had come across during my subclass training that I've been exposed to that I know of. So she basically didn't do any extra research. She just went back to articles that she already knew of. Doesn't really help me, does it? And why is subclass training important as you made this examination in this case? It's important so that an examiner knows how to recognize them and be able to observe them, whether that's directly on the firearm or whether it is on an object that is received without a firearm. This is the final research article we're going to have to ask your reference or refer to the jury on, that we're going to have you reference or refer to the jury on. What did this tell you that assisted you in your examination? So she didn't, all she did was look at a couple of articles and was like, yep, okay, so these marks must be consistent, is what I'm thinking here. So in this particular examination here, this is actually a repeat of the study with the consecutively made extractors. So this analyst here actually received the extractors. He went also sent the judge, can I ask a preliminary question, says Mr. Rosie? You may. Ma'am, these extractors that were received, were they the same kind of extractors that were manufactured or tooled for a Sig Sauer P226? She says they have the same type of process that could potentially be used on an extractor that would be put into a Sig Sauer, but it is not the extractor that would be inserted into a Sig. So again, comparing apples to oranges. It's not in the sense of comparing apples to oranges. This goes to the ability. In this case, this particular article actually looks at an examiner who uses extractors markings in lead versus actual test firing the firearm to come to a conclusion. Mr. Rosie says, you don't know that they're like the extractor in that firearm, do you? No, I cannot prove that. Same objection as earlier. Overruled. Thank you. Weight versus admissibility, says the court. Mr. Luttrell says, why is that not apples to oranges? Why did this information help your opinion? This helped me form my opinion in the sense that the examiner here used the extractors to make marks into lead, into make marks into lead? I don't know. Lead or lead, whatever. It's not really clear. He then used those marks to compare to the items that he received, the fired cartridge cases, to be able to make an identification. So this supports the fact that you don't need a fired cartridge case or a cycled cartridge. An examiner can make a conclusion simply by making marks with these tools. It could be from a cast, it could be from making that mark in lead, so it's not necessary to always have to fire or cycle a firearm to come to a conclusion. Find that hard to believe. Thank you. I'll ask you to return to your seat if you would, and you can take your material with you. Ma'am, were you prepared to display to the jury two short videos that talked about the manufacturer of the Sig Sauer? Yes, I was. And why would that be helpful in for the jury to understand your identification in this manner in your examination? So these two videos show how a pistol barrel at Sig Sauer would be manufactured. It also is indicative of what I have observed in literature from the Rachel Bolton King article that talks about the milling of a barrel itself. It is also represented in this video through a walkthrough of how Sig manufactures their items. It also shows you in the two videos how a firearm comes together. Okay, this is all great and all if I wanted to know how firearms were manufactured, but none of this shows me how the markings on whatever they're comparing makes any sense and why it's the same. Okay, great. We can watch videos on how firearms are made, but what does that have to do with anything? She says it also shows you in the two videos how a firearm comes together, so some people may think that a firearm is just spit out from a machine and it's right there, but there's actually a lot more processes that are involved. Parts can be ordered from a third-party company and they can be assembled into these firearms, and some parts are made in-house. So this video just represents what you might see at a Sig Sauer manufacturing plant. Mr. Luttrell says, for demonstrative purposes, Your Honor, we would like to display the first of the two videos. No objection, says Rosie. The court says, all right, you may. Mr. Luttrell says, may we approach? Certainly. And we have a quick sidebar. I think there's about 6 minutes between these two videos, and so they played fine when we turned the TV on. The court says, of course they did, now they don't. Mr. Luttrell says, they played fine this morning. Court says, do we want a break? Is that what you're saying? Mr. Luttrell says, yes, if we could take a break. The court says, okay. Mr. Rosie says, we'll just do it after lunch. Mr. Luttrell says, yeah, break for lunch. Court says, just do it. Okay. Yeah, fine. Okay, that's fine. The court says, this is not the first time. Mr. Rosie says, the anticipation will kill everybody, I'm sure, but we'll do it after lunch. The court says, okay, we'll go ahead and break. Court says, all right, not surprising, we're having technical difficulties, ladies and gentlemen, so we're going to go ahead and break for lunch. And hold on, I think I'm only have a few more pages to get to cross-examination. 1 second, let me just double check. Yeah, so we're just going to go a couple more pages until we get to the end of direct, and then we'll be done with direct examination, and then tomorrow's episode will start off with cross. So I just wanted to end at a good break. Of course, so now we're back from this break. The court says, all right, you may be seated. You can go ahead and step down from the stand. The witness says, thank you. The court says, Ms. Oberg, all right. So we'll recess until about 1 and oh, this is still before the lunch break, sorry. So they go off record. Now we're back on record. Court says, okay, could I have counsel at Sidebar, please. Court says, okay, very good. Okay, just wanted to make sure the record that, for the record, that we met in chambers just a few minutes ago to explain to the attorneys that juror number 15, who was alternate seat number 3, had a family emergency with some issues going on at home. First, thank you for meeting with me and thank you for your agreement that he really just needed to go home and take care of the situation. So, counsel has agreed to allow juror 15 and alternate seat 3 to go home. There's a member of Carroll County Sheriff's Department that is escorting him back to the hotel. The bailiff, the female bailiff, that is the one that he shared his corners with, is driving him back to Fort Wayne and will get him to his vehicle and probably follow him home just to make sure he gets home okay. Does this fairly accurately represent our conversation from outside of the court? Mr. McClellan says, yes, Judge. From the state's perspective, I agree with the court's recitation. Mr. Baldwin says, it does, Your Honor. Court says, okay, and no issues with sending him home? No, no issues. And I appreciate that, says the court. When the bailiffs went back into the jury room to let him know, he broke down crying. Mr. Baldwin says, I wanted to ask that. Mr. McClellan said, okay. The court says he was the relief that in this young man was palpable. He's going to immediately, when he gets back to the hotel, he'll have access to the telephone again, and he's indicating to us that he's immediately going to call his partner and let his partner know that he's on his way home, that hopefully his partner will be relieved. Something inaudible. Baldwin says okay. Court says okay. Mr. Baldwin says thank you. Mr. McClelland says thank you, Judge. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, says the court. Cyber conference concluded. The court says, okay, is our technology working where we can display the videos? Mr. Luttrell says, we will, in the singular, Your Honor. Okay, one video, says Mr. Luttrell. Court says, okay, and your witness, do you want her back up on the chair? He says, yes, I do. And so that you're not popping up and down when the jury comes back in, you can just stand next to the stand, Ms. Oberg, and I'll just remind you that you're still under oath. The bailiff says, all rise. The jury enters the room. The bailiff says, thank you, you may be seated. Court says, thank you, gentlemen. All right. Well, welcome back, folks. I hope lunch was okay. The attorneys have indicated they are ready to proceed, and I think we got the technical issues figured out. And Ms. Oberg, I'll just remind you that you're still under oath. The witness says, okay, thank you. Mr. Luttrell, says the court. Mr. Luttrell says, yes, Your Honor, for demonstrative purposes, we would like to go ahead and play one of the 2 videos that we had intended to play. For technical difficulties, the second video we will not play. We would like to play this at this time. The court says you may. Ms. Oberg, as a firearm examiner, how does that information on the video relate to your examination that you conducted in this case? The examination in this case, based on that video, it lets me know how there is a potential of how SIG firearms are manufactured. It also touched on the base that the barrels are drilled and milled in that step process so that what I was observing had consistency with being milled in that barrel area. It also highlights some of the important facts of how firearms are made, and that is, it's not just an assembly line, one right after another. There's different pieces and components that are made by different parts of things in a factory. Parts such as firing pins, the extractor or the ejector, those parts can come from other third-party sources, so they may not be made in-house. In the shorter second video that we had intended to show, how did it help inform you as a firearm examiner in your analysis in this case? The second video just went more in depth about their assembly process and how they acquire their parts and how they assemble them, which I had already touched on. Basically, it just lets me know that their processes that they do, it's just not one machine making all the tools in that type of firearm. And does that relate to the Bolton King article that you referenced and quoted from? Yes, it does. And that relates to the issue of when you identify a characteristic, helping inform how to know whether it is an individual or a subclass. It can help aid in knowing the manufacturing process and being able to look at research that might be relevant to that type of manufacturing process. Ma'am, your identification that this cartridge was cycled in this firearm was based on what? It was based on sufficient agreement of quality and quantity of marks from both. From all the areas that I observed agreement in, which were the ejector mark, the extractor mark, and the marks on the head of the cartridge. And what is the significance that you related? You identified the three different tools impacting that cartridge. The three different tools areas helped me know that it's not just one area. I'm able to look at not only the areas in the firearm and where they lined up as far as class characteristics, but I'm able to look at the different tools that came into contact with those areas. So it's not just one tool area, it's three different tooled areas. Is the final stage of level 1 and level 2 analysis that you described is at the end, once you come to a determination, is there you mentioned a verification process? Yes, there's a verification process that follows my examination process. And would you explain to the jury what that consists of? The verification process is where a second examiner will examine the comparative part of my work. So, in our laboratory system, an email would be sent out to the other examiners detailing only that the number of items that need to be looked at. They don't get any conclusions. We just give them numbers of items. And the reason we do that is so that the examiner can work it into their schedule to do the verification process. So if I have 100 items, that they're probably going to have to sit down for a day to look at all of those items. So that's why we give them the number of items that we would have to verify. Other than that, when the verification process starts, I hand over the items of evidence that need to be verified to the second examiner, and then they do the workup on the scope themselves and they come to the conclusion and they write a verification sheet. Do you stand there and give them your account of how you came to your identification while you're doing that? No, I don't. By 2022, sometime prior to 2022, had you established the patterns of when you request verification? I tried to have everything verified at that time so an examiner wouldn't just be verifying identifications, they could be verifying either they're an exclusion, an inclusive, an inconclusive, sorry, or an identification. So those three different classes that it could be or whatever. And would your team know that was your pattern? Yes, any examiner at any time could have anything verified. It didn't have to be an identification. In our system, you had to have identifications verified and you also had to have exclusions that were excluded based on individual characteristics verified. The other ones would be verified, but they didn't have to be verified. So, going a step above, I knew that the outside community would like to see us do all of the verifications instead of just parts of the verification. And who did the verification process in this particular instance? In this particular instance, it was my supervisor, Mark Keisler. He's the supervisor of the firearms and tool mark unit. Yes, he is. And how long has he been a firearms and tool mark examiner? Over 20 years. And what was the result of his verification? He was able to identify the cartridge as having been cycled in the firearm that was submitted to me. Was his verification in agreement with your findings? He wrote, he writes his own separate verification sheet, so he agreed that it was an identification. I have no further questions. Mr. Rosie, and that's where we're going to pick up next time with the cross examination of Melissa Oberg, which I can't wait to get into. I'm glad Rosie's doing it because I think he's a little bit more thorough in his examination, or he's a lot tougher than Baldwin is. Baldwin's like you're playing good cop, bad cop, I would say Baldwin's the bad cop, or Baldwin's the good cop. Rosie's more of the bad cop because he's a little more forceful in his questioning and whatnot. So I'm glad Rosie's doing the questioning of this witness. So I'm looking forward to seeing what she has to say on cross when pressed about her many long-winded winding answers that led to nowhere. I still have yet to realize or to understand how she made the determination. And she still hasn't explained yet that she had to fire the gun. She had to fire the test bullet to match the cycled bullet. So how does a fired bullet and a cycled bullet, how can you compare the two? It is comparing apples to oranges, which is what I've said from time and time again about this whole bullet and the fact that it is just not reliable. The source is not reliable. This woman's answers don't cut it for me. But we're not done. So make sure you are here tomorrow and we will continue with Melissa Oberg's testimony and I will see you then. Please don't forget to hit the like button and have a great day. Talk to you guys later. Take care.